Hi there, folks. So last night, Jacob Rees-Mogg used his GB News show opening monologue to throw as much right-wing propaganda as he could at his audience. He cast as much shade as he possibly could over the quote-unquote Kangaroo Court, or as we normal folk like to call it, the Privileges Committee. He also suggested Boris Johnson's appearance in the Kangaroo Court is some kind of Remainers' revenge because Boris Johnson thrust Brexit upon us. And he also explained his reasons for voting against the Stormont break, claiming it put power back into the hands of the EU. But more importantly, his hero, Boris Johnson, had figured out a way of getting the Northern Ireland Protocol to work. And that was through a method he described as, quote unquote again, strength, through the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill and through trying to negotiate with the EU. And of course, strength is right-wing jargon for breaking international law. We know that already. So, a load of old nonsense in his monologue from Jacob Rees-Mogg, as always, bending himself into a pretzel to try and convince his audience that black is white and white is black. And Tessa Dunlop was sitting nearby during his monologue, and she called Jacob Rees-Mogg out on a few things here. I'm just going to play it in its entirety and see what you think of it.
So, tell me, what do you think of the Kangaroo Court, the marsupials?
I don't. I find it extraordinary mental gymnastics. You've managed to conflate a parliamentary reticence about Brexit, which there clearly was from 2016 onwards, with interrogating Boris Johnson's integrity over his claims to the House, his assurances to the House that he didn't knowingly break the COVID rules. I mean, there is a giant Waterloo. There's a huge gap between those two issues. I don't see them having any overlap, with the exception of our ex-Prime Minister's failure to pay attention to detail. How can he nip out of his so-called, as you've dubbed it, Kangaroo Court, to vote down the Windsor Framework when it is so much better than what both you and him voted in January 2020 for Northern Ireland?
Because
it's
not better. It's worse because it solidifies what is in the protocol, and under international law it will be harder to get out of than getting out of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So
I'm astonished he has the nerve to bring up international law. The Northern Ireland Protocol Bill would have broken international law. But he knows this.
Makes the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill harder to pass. That's why it's worse.
What you two and 20 other Tories are trying to do is salvage your reputations, because actually, as the Spartan Brexiteers, you secretly know...
I wasn't a Spartan.
Well, I know, but in that idea of being stripped back and brave and sovereign, you know that you shouldn't have signed up to that backstop if you really believed.
No, I went for MV3 and wasn't a Spartan because I recognised we needed to get Brexit, and I thought the whole thing was at risk at that time.
So you fudged it.
And therefore I was willing to accept getting to Brexit. Of course, in politics you don't get the perfect. You must know that.
Of course I know that, but all I'm saying is this is better than the horribly imperfect that was dumped on us from January 2020, and you guys are going, still not good enough. Now, you know that it's not going to carry. Of course, the bill won hands down. Finally, they're going to get Cumberland sausages in Belfast, and we're going to have chrysanthemums with dirty soiled roots from goodness knows where, perhaps Scotland even, who knows if they're still talking to us. But the point is, Jacob, you've been beaten and you've got egg on your face, and you can't conflate Boris Johnson being a Brexiteer with him being called to account for his honesty on COVID.
He didn't say anything that he didn't believe to be true on COVID. And if you'd listened to the evidence, you may well have done.
I took notes.
It was quite clear that he thought that the rules were being followed, and he made a very clear explanation as to how they were followed and what the rules actually said, that you had to have social distancing if possible. And in Downing Street, an 18th century townhouse, that wasn't always possible.
Where he came unstuck consistently was, on the one hand, he seemed to know what the rules were. Oh, we went outside, we opened the windows. And on the other hand, oh, whoopsie, didn't know what the rules were. We're relying on aids. What kind of aids? Oh, aids I can't name. Comms people. I mean, it was pretty thin. I think even you must have felt uncomfortable for he's your ally, isn't he? He's your Brexit leader.
No, he's Jacob Rees-Mogg's God, I think you'll find.
I thought that was perfectly normal, that ministers, and obviously the Prime Minister as well, rely on their aides to give them information on things that they will not have been present at. That he couldn't have been everywhere in 10 Downing Street. He couldn't possibly have known that parties were going on when he was at Chequers. He just couldn't have done.
In the end, whether you fancy the marsupials or Boris, people have already probably made up their minds. But what today was about, with a thumping great victory for your technocrat Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, it's about you guys, your hardcore Brexiteer fragment, including Boris. You're suddenly out of fashion, aren't you, Jacob? Let's be honest, you're being left behind by the tide here.
I don't think that's right. I think the vote today, because the Labour Party was supporting it, was always going to go through.
It was a thumper. 515 to 29.
I wouldn't say that big majorities in the House of Commons are always right. I was one of 13 who voted against the idiotic recommendations of Leveson, against 530 who voted to regulate the British press. I thought the 13 were right and the 530 were wrong. And actually, the law has now followed the 13, not the 530. So the size of the majority does not necessarily recognise the quality of the argument. That's always true in the House of Commons.
But also more broadly, I've got no skin in the political game. I have a reasonable long view. But more broadly, Jacob, and I recognise that you're highly entertaining, you're deeply charming. You know, I've had a little bit of the Jacob fairy dust off air here, and I too am hook, line and sinkered. But actually, when we break it down, I watched a panorama the other night that left me sleepless. And these are hard facts you can't argue with. Since 2008, exacerbated by Brexit, the average Brit, many of whom will be watching and liking you and Boris, backing you, Boris, we are £4,000 poorer than the average German. On average, me as a Brit, £4,000 poorer. Our poorest are 20% poorer than their French equivalent or their German equivalent.
But the UK economy was inevitably more hard hit by the financial crisis in 2008, which you then lower the base for the future comparisons because we are more dependent on financial services and economy.
And we've exacerbated it because of failures in our manufacturing, our production base, and you know it. Well, 360 billion that we haven't invested since 2016,
Actually,
Jacob.
the great success potential for our economy of Brexit is the freedoms for our financial services, which is where our growth will come. We are...
Oh, joy. Financial deregulation, folks. Oh, we're really looking forward to that. What could possibly go wrong?
Service economy, not a manufacturing
Are you going to
economy.
have to then withdraw from being part of the Conservative Party under Rishi Sunak? Because he said that the Northern Ireland was the most exciting economic zone on the planet, I think was it, or in the world. And I don't know how you can round that circle that Rishi is now presenting us with a pre-Brexit status quo.
Northern Ireland is almost entirely dependent on government expenditure, on taxpayers' expenditure. It is not dependent on private sector flows and hasn't been for a long time.
And what he said just there, by the way, is why a lot of Tories are happy to cut Northern Ireland loose. They see Northern Ireland as a financial burden and wouldn't be much fussed if Northern Ireland left the United Kingdom.
So he was lying then when he was saying
I
that.
disagree with that point.
You disagree?
But if you look at German manufacturing, that's now facing difficulties because of loss of orders from China. It's not easy for Germany either.
No, but it's relative. And they are £4,000 per head better off than us. And that, I care about that.
But from the starting point you have chosen, which takes
2008.
which takes in the sharpest decline in financial services, which is our biggest economic factor. So that is a very arbitrary basis, inevitably going to go against the interests of the UK. What we have now is a chance, and it's in the House of Lords at the moment, is financial services reform, which will make us more competitive in financial services, will help us to grow the economy, whilst Germany is suffering from manufacturing overdependence on China.
So while we're tinkering around, and we have, I think you would agree that the integrity of British politics, whether it was Blair on Iraq War or Boris Johnson over COVID cake, it's taken a battering. None of us know what to believe anymore. But the economy has shrunk by 4% post-Brexit. Can you tell us down the barrel it's going to get better? Can you promise us it's going to get better?
You can never promise what will happen to the economy. That wouldn't be true. You can make economic policies that help the economy, and these are the supply...
Or you can back campaigns based on lies that adversely affect the economy.
...side reforms. That is the absolutely essential thing. I've just heard, Mayor, we're out of time, but I do I hope you'll come back on again. We must continue this conversation.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
To that.
Indeed, to Tessa. But
So I thought she did pretty well there, because it's very easy to be bamboozled by Jacob Rees-Mogg's nonsense, because it sounds quite convincing at times. It's only when you take a step back you realise that he's talking absolute shite almost 100% of the time. Just sounds good. Sounds like good shite, you know? So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. I thought Tessa did a decent job on challenging Rees-Mogg on the Stormont break hypocrisy and his insistence the Privilege Committee was nothing but revenge on Boris for Brexit. And she also did well to hold him to account on Brits being poorer than Germans, £4,000 worse off than Germans since 2008. And goodness me, isn't it so typical of him to suggest that narrowing that £4,000 gap that has accumulated is by deregulating financial services. Oh, boy, you couldn't make it up. All right, cheers for watching.